Started. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Karthik Ramani. He's a distinguished professor of mechanical engineering at Purdue. He got his PhD from the Indian Institute of Science, a master's from the Ohio State University, and a PhD from Stanford. He has won numerous awards. Pretty much anything that you can think of, I think he has won an award in, including the most cited paper, the NSF Career Award, the Engineer of the Year Award. I mean, basically, he has like a page full of awards, so I don't think I'll bore you with his awards, but rather let him speak and talk about how he's using heat mapping and heat kernel ideas in mechanical engineering. Thank you.
Thanks, Vishy, and thanks for having me here. This paper actually is based on work mostly done by Yifang, who's there. You can just stand up. So if you have more detailed questions, please talk to him, and he's hanging around in the workshop. And also Mengqian, both of them are PhD candidates. And an earlier colleague of mine actually was in the math department here, now moved to University College in London. He made some contributions. And we have a fairly reasonable history in this area, although this is one of the first presentations that we are making in this area. And actually, the two papers, I'm sure many of you are familiar with CVPR conference. How many of you are familiar with it? Quite a few. OK, about 15, 20. So the CVPR this year, we have two papers. And both of them will be available on our website, the heat mapping paper. And this is a regular paper. There are two regular papers we have. The other one is with Professor Vishwanathan, who's running the workshop. And the second paper is a workshop paper. It's dependent on the first one. So you can pick up both these from our website. And to get to our website, just Google my name, and you should be able to get to the publications. OK? So I'll be talking about these two concepts and ideas, and then showing some applications. In fact, you can sort of consider this whole presentation as between geometric computing, applied math, maybe to some extent, and shapes and design. So first, wanted to acknowledge all the organizers of this workshop, Vishwanathan and others, Sergey and several others in CS department as well as the math department here. Also the Donald Feddersen professorship that I hold that helped me co-sponsor part of this workshop, and also the Discovery Park for helping provide some of the venues for some of the events. So the outline of my talk here is simply just to give you a basic motivation of the broad area, not generally specifically applied to geometry, which is most of what I'm going to talk about. But in general, a lot of the things that I'm talking about are applicable to statistical manifolds in general. Okay? So the data points I'm going to be talking about are points in space. But as I talk, you can imagine them to be documents or can be applied to social networks or other kinds of networks. We are just starting to apply it to other areas. I'll give an example at the end of my talk being applied to protein networks. But as you can see, a lot of the ideas have come from geometric, 3D geometry-based methods. So I'll talk about some of the key contributions, some basic fundamentals. Many of you are perhaps new to the heat and diffusion kernel-based ideas. These are emerging areas, and lastly, I'll just talk a little bit about the future directions. Okay, so first, the big thing that's been going on in the last 15 years, perhaps, and 10 years is that we are creating lots of data, right? Everybody is creating a lot of data, and our rate of creation of data far exceeds the kinds of mathematical frameworks we have, the tools we have, and computational methods that we have to understand and analyze this kind of data. And in particular, also in everything that you look around you, all these are designed environments, the computer, everything you wear, and literally the whole world that we navigate around is a design world, and these objects all resided in the computer at some time, okay, before they got made. And in order for us to analyze and make sense of this emerging world, both created objects as well as objects that exist naturally, such as protein in terms of bio-informatics, and biomedical applications, etc. All these are all environments where the objects have a certain amount of 3D content in it, and these kinds of objects are being created in a very increasing manner. Also, a lot of the data in engineering, for instance, from simulation and experiments and so on, they also tend to grow simply because the instruments that we have created ourselves are making these things grow even faster. So what are we going to talk about? So we're going to talk about how we can sense this, search, for instance, understand and discover and construct knowledge from this data on the go. Okay, and this is one of our central goals, is to be able to do these kinds of operations. And a central thesis in terms of what I'm going to talk about is discovering structure in this data. Okay, if you read the Science Journal, one of the very recent, I think 2008 papers actually talks about the relationship between diffusion-based ideas and the PageRank, which Google uses. So in our opinion, the structure-based methods that we are exploring at this time hold a lot of promise, much beyond search-based ideas that are currently being explored by more of the commercial world. So if we want to go beyond data to exploring and understanding the structures that are embedded within this data, we need new frameworks, and we'll talk about a couple of these ideas. So exploring shape of the data, for instance, what kinds of functions can we perform on the data? Can we determine certain relationships that exist that we don't know about? And some simple operations are things like clustering and so on that many of you in the computational world are familiar with. Symmetry, patterns, and so on. Further, if you can also visualize and interact with this, we'll be able to determine new types of structures. So broadly speaking, how can we look at low-dimensional embeddings of this high-dimensional data? And further, how can we use distances? So we'll talk about distances, how we can use local and maybe even global distances and put them all together in ways that will help us dissect and perform operations on this data. So before I get into details, I just wanted to give you some general ideas about distances in 3D objects, in particular based on some of our recent work. And one of our postdocs now, he's a professor in Tsinghua in computer science, actually a tenured professor. He is, and another student of us who's also a professor in Tsinghua in mechanical engineering. They developed this idea of 3D inner distance. And the idea of 3D inner distance is to measure distances within an object, entirely within the object, as opposed to the surface and so on. And this is an interesting distance because, for instance, if you have a 3D inner distance in my body, I mean, there's a distance from my finger and to my arm or to my shoulder. Even if I bend my arm and do other operations, the distance measured inside the object is invariant to changes in the shape of the object. So if I can use this kind of a distance, compute it very quickly, then I can perform a lot of interesting operations such as similarity in protein structures and so on. And you can see that a lot of these objects, for instance, have identical geodesic distances. So geodesic distances can't distinguish between them, but something like an inner distance can actually distinguish and do a lot of interesting operations. Okay, so if you want further details on this, the IEEE PAMI journal has this. It's in print. It should appear. It will also be on our website. It just got accepted last week. So you can see this on our website, how to compute this and what you can do with it. But more interesting than just the 3D inner distance, as I point out here, these distances are measured inside the object as opposed to the surface or directly as a D2 or other types of distances. You can do some interesting things with these kinds of distances. We'll talk about this new heat mapping and heat distance in a short time. But basically, if you look at this protein structure, we're just deforming it, okay? And in this case, for instance, if you look at A, B, and C, and D, different conformations of the same protein, you can sort of see that the Euclidean distance is a histogram, which is got by simply measuring the Euclidean distance between pairwise points and then constructing a histogram out of it, the number of distances on the y-axis and the actual distance on the x-axis. You can see that it changes. Inner distance, on the other hand, as I showed earlier in A, B, and C, okay, it's largely invariant when A, B, and C are in conformations where portions don't touch each other. But the moment they start touching each other, you'll start seeing that the inner distance starts failing. You know, the short circuit between these 2 points gives rise to a lot of inner distances that connect this portion, for instance, to this portion, and you'll see a bump in the histogram. Okay, so here comes the idea of diffusion distance, and diffusion distance is sort of related to the heat mapping and heat distance. That's why I'm sort of giving you this idea here. So if you sort of look at diffusion distance between point A and point B, you can see that, you know, there's a number of pathways for diffusion to occur between A and B. So as a result, what happens is if you have some short topological short circuits in an object, or in general in a manifold, it could be a graph in general. If you sort of treat this object as a bunch of points and it's meshed with triangles, you know, you can make a graph out of it. So I'm sort of making some statements which are somewhat general, but perhaps tested more in 3D. So you can look at that the short circuit, this distance sort of gets averaged, and a lot of these other distances start dominating. So you don't see a change in the histogram. So all these histograms are sort of very interesting because, you know, if I can construct a histogram which carries a lot of meaning based on the shape, then I can do a lot of operations very quickly. Okay? So histograms are useful, but the question really is, what is a histogram and how do you construct it and how do you make it do interesting things that you want it to do? Okay, so what are our goals now? So I mean, our goal basically is to talk about the heat kernel and use it as a tool. It's a tool in unsupervised machine learning. And you know, of course, as I was mentioning earlier, you know, it has potential to do document and web analysis. It can be used in bioinformatics, engineering design, and many other areas where you want to transform data to knowledge in general. But the interesting observation that we'll sort of build upon is that the heat mapping analysis using the heat kernel sort of it's based on the idea of diffusion. And you know, if you all know where diffusion came in, Einstein worked on diffusion, and if you sort of look at work done by Fourier and so on, they looked at actually Fourier looked at the Fourier analysis and all were developed based on heat transfer problems. Okay, they were actually working on engineering applications. That's how they got intuition. The mathematical intuition came from working on engineering problems. That said, I think we have gone a whole circle around. We are coming back with the heat kernel and starting to look at data. So what we are doing here is we are trying to use this type of a framework, which the heat kernel provides that we develop on, to reveal the detailed knowledge of the structure, and most importantly, without making assumptions on the structure. Okay, a lot of the operations that I'm going to show you later in terms of performing on geometry have been done by a lot of people. Okay, but the problem with all those methods is you need a lot of assumptions on the data. Okay, so our method is I would say largely assumption free. So that's a big jump. So even if you have seen these kinds of data, really you have to ask, or seen these types of results in computer graphics or other areas, you have to ask, you know, where does it come from? Okay, so very quickly, here's a quick simulation of, you know, heat being applied to the top of the octopus head, and then it's diffusing around and accumulating in all the sharp regions like the tentacles and so on. So what does heat diffusion do? So heat was applied here to a point. So the heat kernel is basically it comes from the heat equation, and it is governed by flow of heat on a manifold. Okay, and so here L is the Laplacian, which is calculated on manifold, and the interesting instrument that we have to look at the structure is time t. Okay, so although I'm not going to talk too much about the time here, it's certainly a tool that we can use to understand scale. Okay, time and scale are sort of related to each other. Go ahead.
I think it is like kind of talking about this green function.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So in your case, it can be any manifold, because mostly what I have looked at is like a sphere we talk about.
Yeah, it can be an n-dimensional manifold. Really, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be 3D, but most of the talk is going to be in the original manifold is 3D, but we perform operations on a much higher dimension. But we also apply it to statistical manifold. I'll talk about distances. It's directly related to the Green's function. That's where it comes from. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so so the heat kernel is actually calculated using, in our case, the Laplace-Beltrami operator. Okay, and it's used to characterize the surface. So I'm going to be talking about surfaces in general, and you can see some reconstruction of this original object based on the Eigen analysis of the Laplacian here, and 5, 10, and 50 eigenfunctions of the operator are used to construct the object. And as you can see, you start capturing more and more original content of the object. Okay, but also interestingly, you can apply it to these points, and we'll talk about this in a minute. You can use it to understand the local shape of the manifold, but also more globally, you can use to perform operations like segmenting this object and figuring out some interesting salient points in the object. Okay, so all points in the manifold are not equally important. So how do you determine whatever your interests lie in? So these methods help you understand the objects using some of these distances, and a lot of the tools that underlie this come from differential geometry. Okay, sort of that's very basic to understanding shapes, especially shapes that are created with point clouds and so on. Okay, unstructured in general, and so we sort of explore this using physics-based methods, and some of the ideas it leads to is things like the heat mean signature. We'll talk about heat center and heat sinks, and last I'll talk about this temperature distribution descriptor, which can be used for searching on shapes. Okay, certain types of shapes. So they're all physics-based ideas in general. Okay, so in particular, the motivation of this section of the talk is shape understanding, and it's a very low-level task in terms of computer vision in some sense, and in CAD and medical imaging and bioinformatics and so on. So you can start seeing that all these areas are going to start using more and more machine learning type ideas. Okay, it's inevitable, and there's going to be more 3D content that's coming along. You're already seeing the Kinect come up, 3D TV. It's all going to be a 3D world in another decade or so. Okay, so the virtual world is transformed gradually. So you can see that the algorithms that, for instance, that partition this horse model in this way, can it be done without human supervision? If so, how? So we'll answer that question. And are these two models the same? They are in very different poses. As a human, we can say this very quickly, but can the computer understand these shapes and be able to perform these operations without any human intervention? Okay, so the contributions of in particular these two papers are related to interpreting data using underlying physics-based meanings, and also developing concepts such as heat affinity, heat mean signature, heat center, and heat sinks, all autonomously or without human intervention, and that's important for us to be able to do this on large amounts of data, and it happening while you sleep. Right, so in some sense, and algorithms for applying these types of heat-driven framework, the heat mapping and temperature distribution descriptor. Also interesting is this idea of segmentation. It's sort of although it's shown on geometric objects here, this is in computer graphics or computer vision, they call this segmentation. One of the important questions is how can we make algorithms or algorithms perform this segmentation, okay, in ways that humans perceive these objects. Okay, so naturally you separate out parts of the object. Okay, and the question is how do you do that in a perceptually consistent manner, no matter if the shapes have noise in it, the data points have noise in it, and or they are in different poses. Okay, so some basics here. Well, so the basic idea stems all comes from heat flow across a network, and pretty much governed by the heat equation, so the heat distribution in time is governed by this equation. L is a Laplacian here, and T is time, and X denotes a node in the network. Okay, and really what we are looking at is how can you use the heat equation and compute it in a discrete setting? Number one. Number two is therefore how can you compute it on graphs in general, and more particularly how can you use the aggregate of knowledge of how heat moves across the surface, or the intelligence of heat And really, we are building on mathematics that has been developed over decades. And so there's a lot of the foundations here that help us do a lot of these things. Okay, so essentially the exponential of the Laplacian times time will help us look at how heat moves. And here HTij in this form is got from the Laplacian. So the eigenvalues and the eigenvectors of it. Okay, so you can sum them across and you can look at the amount of heat that arrives at node I if unit amount of heat is applied at node j. Okay, so essentially you can get a matrix here, and for instance, if you look at the row of the matrix, it will tell you the amount of heat that moves between two vertices. In some sense, it's probabilistic. So what is the probability that a certain amount of heat will arrive at node j when a unit amount of heat is applied at node I? Okay, so that's what this is doing. And in the case of 3D models, you basically have a graph of vertices and edges. And the trick here, partly the very basic trick to construct the graph of the object is to calculate the weights of the edges. Okay, and in general, in a statistical manifold, these weights will come from some similarity measures and so on. But what we do is we calculate the weight on a mesh. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about that, and then we'll move on. Okay, so the Laplacian is simply calculated by finding out the difference between the diagonal matrix and the weights. The weights are got by calculating W for each of the vertices, and the diagonal matrix is just the summation of all the weights Wij. So once you get the weight matrix or get all the weights for all the edges, you're in good shape. You can pretty much compute a number of the heat kernel operators. So you can construct the heat affinity, okay, which we talked about a moment ago. You can calculate heat distances. This is analogous to the diffusion distance that I talked about earlier, okay, and then you can also we come up with the concept of heat coordinates for each of the points. It's simply the embedding in the heat space of these points. Okay, so in terms of the Laplacian on a mesh, there are a few things that you will have to do. Basically, if you look at a point, and this is a mesh or the neighborhood of the point, you can construct the Laplacian here simply by using some simple ideas. And the idea that we use is called a cotan rule. You sort of look at this edge. You're going to calculate a weight for the edge. So you look at the cotangents of the angles across the edge, and you can calculate Mij. That gives you some of the elements of the Laplacian. Okay, so in some sense, what it's characterizing is the curvature at that point on the surface. Okay, and you sort of lift this point up out of the surface, you'll sort of see these come closer to 90, and it'll sort of go to 0. So you'll sort of get some weights for the edges, which sort of will help you construct the Laplacian, and it is sensitive to curvature, and now we can apply the heat kernel. So the idea of heat mean signature is a little is one step beyond this. So what you can do now is you can simply look at the rows of that matrix. You allow heat to propagate for a certain time. You stop. So essentially, you have applied heat at all the vertices, allowed it to propagate for a certain time, and then you look at the row of that matrix, and you can just sum it up over all the elements of that row. Essentially, it gives you the contribution to the ith node of the heat coming to that node from all the other nodes. Okay, so that gives you an interesting signature, which we call the heat mean signature, and it turns out that it can do a lot of neat things for us. Okay, and we'll exploit that idea. And also using the heat mean signature, you can use it for discovering heat centers and heat sinks. Interestingly, these all have analogies. You know, we talk about this in our lab a lot. So in different settings, they mean different things. Okay, so in graphs, they are important points. Okay, for where if you put heat, it's going to spread rapidly, or heat accumulates rapidly at these fingertips, for instance. Okay, so so again, the heat mean signature allows us to eventually discover these different perceptually consistent mesh segments. Okay, so we'll talk about these things in a minute. Okay, so how do we work on from now on? So heat mapping for segmentation. So heat mapping, what this does for us is it's basically a couple of algorithms which use the heat mean signature. Okay, so it helps us discover what we call perceptually consistent mesh segmentations. And it turns out that a group in computer science just very recently did a benchmark. They studied a large number of shapes, and they asked humans to segment it, and they created a benchmark. So what we did was we just compared our results that were computed to their benchmark. Okay, so what do you want it to do? You want it to be invariant to post changes. No matter how you deform the legs of the horse and tails and so on, it should not change. And then it should be robust to perturbations on the surface, which is noise typically, and also be close in conformation to human perception. These are the nice properties one would like to have. So if we I'm just going to start talking about some basis for how robust this heat mapping approach is, simply because you're looking at how heat moves between two nodes. So no matter what happens in between, if it's not a big change, it remains consistent over different poses of the object, and also when the object has a lot of noise on the surface. So it's very robust to both deformation as well as noise. Okay, so there are some interesting observations that help us guide the segmentations and take away some of the central assumptions. For instance, like in k-means or other algorithms you have to have input in terms of the number of segments, and also you need seed points to start the clustering. So how do you become independent of all these things that tie us down? So what we do here is we simply look at the eigenvalues, okay, interestingly enough, as you look at the eigenvalues in terms of the number of segments, you'll see a sudden change in the number of eigenvalues when the number of segments sort of equilibrate, if you may, at around what is perceptually consistent. Okay, this is an interesting observation. So this sort of helps us guide the later algorithms for segmentation and removes that dependence on knowing the number of clusters a priori. Okay, we have to do more research in this area and figure out exactly why it does. We have some intuitive ideas there. But building on that, what we do is we sort of have an idea of hunting for these heat centers. And as I suggested earlier, heat centers are the important points in each of the segments. But the point is you don't know what the segments are. So how can you discover the segments together with the heat centers? Okay, so how do you combine them together, and then how do you drive to the heat center and drive the k-means using some of the ideas that we developed here. Okay, so we want to find these centers. Okay, so basically how the segmentation, you take the mesh and then we define a clustering cost function, okay, and then you optimize the cost function subject to certain constraints, okay, and all these can be automated, okay. So this we call this the heat mapping solver, and this is the k-center cost function, and essentially you have the clustered data. So I'll give an explanation for how this works, and so for instance here we have 3 clusters and 3 heat centers, okay. So a number of clusters are known based on the eigenvalue change graph that I showed earlier, plotted against a number of segments. So here we define the problem as a maximization problem of 2 minimums. I'll sort of explain this intuitively in a moment. It'll become clear, and it's subject to the constraint that the heat center lies at the maximum of the heat mean signature for all the vertices in that segment. Okay, so that's the basic idea here. All right. So the first step is sort of pick up on the point with the highest heat mean signature. Let's make that the first heat center, okay, and then find the point that with the least affinity to the first heat center. So let's say that it's some point up there, okay, and So make the second point the second heat center. Okay, this is temporarily happening, and cluster the points based on the heat affinities and these two heat centers. So we have partitioned. We have two clusters now, and then we find another point with the largest heat mean signature in the second cluster and make it the heat center for the second cluster. So now that we got the two heat centers for two clusters, we simply iterate. Now we simply go on and find find another point with the least heat affinity to the first two heat centers and make it the third heat center. Okay, so the idea is very, very simple. So as you can see, it will emerge, and the third cluster will emerge from that, and then you get the heat center for the third cluster, and then you got all your three clusters and all your three heat centers. Okay, so it's very very elegant, and it works very robustly. And so I'll show you some experimental results, and then we'll look at the temperature distribution signature. So yeah, just in computer science guys in graphics, they like to work on these kinds of funny models, and it took me a while to get used to all these multimedia models. In engineering, we play with real shapes, but here you have a human and you have a horse, and and this is a centaur model which combines that. So it's interesting that if you can do this here, do this for various poses of humans and various poses of horse, and does it work the same way when you combine these two together, and also move them around into different poses. So as you can see, the segmentations work quite well across all these models. And the other idea is what happens if you remove some of these clusters. We call these the partial models. Okay, so you break it up and throw pieces of this armadillo out, and you chop the head, arms, tail, and so on, and do a bunch of experiments there. It seems to work well. But even more interesting is the property that it's very sensitive to these topological short circuits, moment. Even if you connect these up here, or if fingers touches and so on, your segmentation still is very robust in spite of these connections across. It still continues to segment pretty well. And even more interesting is, look at the amount of noise you have. Even a human can't normally segment this well, so it still continues to work well when the noise is increased to a fairly large amount. Okay, and let's move on here. So yeah, so I'm going to sort of switch from this first thing to my second part. So that's a regular CVPR paper. This is the workshop paper in CVPR. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about the importance of searching on 3D content, and more specifically, we'll talk about what we have done here. So we have been working in this machine learning area for a while, and in different sense, not the heat-based ideas, but this has been more recent. And our group has done a lot of work on searching on 3D content, and there have been a lot of developments around this area. So we really understand shape quite well in terms of how to deal with it. And the idea of comparing shapes is very important. So if you want to read more about it, there's a review paper that we wrote a while ago, and it's got a good summary of the state of art. Then it's changing, but it's still a lot of it is valid. Okay, so searching on 3D content, as I said, it's very, very important. Otherwise, you simply start creating objects again and again. And our original vision about 12 years ago was to look at a question of what is the meaning of Google for engineers, okay? Because we are creating objects, and for instance, that camera and all those lenses and other things. You create one, somebody else is creating another. Pretty soon have a whole bunch of things, and if you can't find it, you're going to create another one again. So there's a lot of issues in design, and then you source a supplier. It creates a lot of problems in industry simply because you just don't know what somebody else has done, and pretty soon you create another bolt for a car or automobile, and you have so many of the same variety. So searching on shapes can reduce you reinventing the wheel, to sort of use that cliche here. But basically, the idea here in terms of descriptors for shape is to come up with compact descriptors that can capture the content robustly, and not only robustly, it should be scalable, meaning that if you want to compare with millions of other objects, you should be able to do it quickly. Okay, but also you want it to have a lot of other properties which are related to invariance in pose, and also isometric transformations, and so on and so forth. Okay, so there are a lot of important aspects in terms of local and global shape capture that you wanted to do. So what do we do with the heat mapping idea, and the heat mean signature that we described earlier? So basically, what you want to do, what we do here is the idea is to for instance, in this horse case, you apply heat at this point and look at the temperature distribution here, and the temperature distribution is again defined in a similar way to how we define the heat spreading from a point, and the average temperature is simply again the average of all the heat values across a particular row. Okay, so the point temperature distribution is you do this for all the points, average it across the horse, and you can sort of see that that you have higher temperatures at points where heat accumulates. It doesn't have ways to escape. There are more ways for heat to come there than to get out. Okay, so basically what we want to do is use this average temperature distribution and convert it into a histogram. Okay, so you simply look at it in the form of a histogram, and now this can perhaps, as we will show later, you'll see that this can be very useful in describing these shapes. Okay, so you sort of look at this again in terms of what the temperature distribution does in here in a flat zone. Okay, so you spread out heat very quickly from here. You have a lower average temperature distribution, whereas if you go to other zones, it doesn't go out that fast. So your temperature is higher, and you average those temperature distributions throughout the object, and you can sort of see that no matter how this lioness is, you have a fairly similar signature for the shape in spite of deformation and also noise in different poses. Okay, so if you can compare histograms, you can search on objects, and that's what we demonstrated here using a database that we composed from a lot of other databases. We combined them, and you can sort of see that this cat model and centaur model, all these retrieve different shapes, and they're all, a dog is retrieving a dog and it's not retrieving a cat. So you can sort of see that the descriptors are able to differentiate themselves. Okay, and it's fairly robust across all poses as well. And this is a similarity matrix that one can easily see that it works across different types of models. Okay, so the other thing that we do in the search area is, we have to qualify these descriptors in terms of precision and recall. So when you mix all these models and put cans and drums and other things in it, and you sort of give a query to the model, look at the retrieval, and the results are qualified by a human as to what the best top 20 or 30 are going to be, and then you can calculate from the retrieved results. You can look at what is relevant and come up with precision and recall. So for an ideal search engine, what you want to do is you want to have a high value of precision no matter what your recall goes. You want it all to be at 1. Okay, so we sort of compared ours with some very recent one. Is the eigenvalue descriptor, and this is an old one that folks at Princeton came up with a while ago. It's a very original paper called Shape Distributions. Well, this was it's called the D2 work. Perhaps it's not, maybe we shouldn't have compared it with the D2. It's not a fair comparison, but this one is a fair comparison because this is supposed to handle the kinds of deformations that we pose on these objects. Okay, so you can see that the temperature distribution descriptor holds well quite robustly across when recall goes up. And every year we run a shape recognition competition. We started one for a couple of databases in engineering for IEEE. It's called SHREC, and so we actually compare. Everybody submits their source code, and we compare it across the database, and those results are published yearly. So if you're really interested in getting access to shape databases, and you develop a new algorithm and you want to compare it, just type Shrek on Google, and you'll go to a lab in Europe that aim at shape, that maintains the shape database. Okay, so roughly speaking, we sort of have an understanding of how we can use heat to understand shape, and also we talked about heat mapping and as a way to segment objects in a perceptually consistent manner. And I talked a little bit about temperature distributions as a means to search on shapes. Okay, so our ongoing work, what are we doing? We are sort of extending this to other types of content, like textual content in patterns, social networks, and other data types. We're also looking at new heat-based functions on a manifold. Some of our work is collaborative with Professor Vishwanathan, and we are continuing to look at how we can actually architect all this together in terms of both visualization as well as navigation in larger data spaces. Some of our recent work, we applied some of these ideas to non-geometric manifolds, and this was published in PLOS One. So basically, the idea here was using diffusion to look at cryo images. These are images that are used to reconstruct protein structures. They're very noisy, as you can see. Even with eye, you can't distinguish what's going on. So we used an idea called Fourier slice theorem, which was developed earlier, to characterize these images and build an affinity matrix. And it works very similar to what I talked about. Use the diffusion mapping and then do the clustering here. And the idea here is to remove the noise in these protein structures. For instance, what happens is you have different conformations of the protein, and when they're reconstructing, they don't know if the images are coming from a conformation that they don't want to look at, and there's no way to throw that group out. So this is very useful as a pre-processing for reconstructing protein. And this work was done with Wen Jiang, who is a professor in biology here. He's published in Nature and so on, is well known and works with the Rossmann group in the structural biology group. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to say, and I wanted to thank some of the people that helped me learn the diffusion kernel, Koifman and his group from Yale, that I learned that from 5-6 years ago, and also NSF, both the IIS as well as another grant, and also Purdue, my School of Mechanical Engineering, and the Donald Feddersen support. Okay, so and then the disclaimer here. So if you have questions, I can answer, but of course, some blatant advertisement. So if you want to sort of hang out with our group and work in math, computer science, and applications, and so on, we have a postdoc opening and our PhD student opening. Typically, we are looking for interest in machine learning, math, computation, and applications. And so if you want to have fun, you can certainly talk to me. I'll be here tomorrow sometime. So questions?
You describe your work on using heat mapping on image segmentation, image reconstruction, and shape clustering. I just wonder if heat mapping and Laplacian function can be used to do image retrievation. If the answer is yes, how to do that?
To do image retrieval?
Image restoration.
Image restoration. Registration or restoration? Registration. Okay. Okay. Actually, yeah, we have done this work for 3D shapes based on point clouds, and Fang is it's a paper that has been submitted or in submission. But for images, we don't typically work with images in particular. It can be used. There are ideas that you can develop based on what we have. Some ideas you can use is you can identify a core of that image, for instance, and try to register if it's partial registration, like where some parts are deformed, where only some portions can be registered. We have developed a method in 3D registers, for instance, deformed animals in different poses, okay, but with the center, so it's partial. So we came up with a measure which is based on the amount of the chord that matches the two objects. So if you are able to come up with a measure that will represent partial alignment of two objects, then you could do that. You could also combine it with other methods such as shape context, which were developed for image-based databases that came out of Berkeley. It sort of represents images maybe at a local level, and you can use some of those descriptors for partial alignment. Okay, you can go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Would you please go back to the flow chart for the shape view? Okay. Yeah. I'm concerned about the last step because you are using the history as the descriptor. So, but in my view, from the average temperature distribution to the history is not one-to-one. I mean, the different distribution might have the same history.
Actually, yeah, that's a very good question. So you don't want to have you want to have a one-to-one mapping between the shape and the descriptor as much as possible. That's where the differentiation of the descriptor comes in. So the temperature distribution descriptor actually does that quite well, okay? And for instance, if you have, let's take a 2D object. If you just have a 2D histogram, okay, and you deform it, in some cases, the same shape, even in the deformed conformations, you want to have the same descriptor. This does that. This is not good for rigid objects where you want constraints captured. If you want the constraints captured in rigid objects, you will use other kinds of descriptors, okay? So here, if you want the descriptor to remain invariant to pose changes, like what we showed, then this works well, okay? Because the temperature distributions won't change no matter how you change the pose of the object. So this is a deformation invariant shape signature. If you want shape signatures to capture the change in the conformation also, or in other structures, then you'll need other descriptors. Okay, it's a good question. Okay, actually, we have developed earlier another few descriptors in this area. You can go to our website and look at it in terms of how good they are in one-to-one mapping. For instance, if you take spherical harmonics, okay, and if I turn my hand and make it my leg and make my leg my hand, you'll still get the same. You'll get the same spherical harmonics. So to differentiate in those cases, we developed something called a 2.5D spherical harmonics. So your question is very central to descriptor development. It's a good question.
So just to understand the histogram, what is your x-axis?
Well, so basically the points and the number of the distance or the temperature and the number of points at that temperature. So it's a temperature here, and the number of points in the temperature. So if you
I guess the temperature is basically the function value defined
on the mesh,
right?
right?
Basically the function and then how many points fall into that particular.
That's correct, exactly.
Okay.
That's
I don't know, like, did you look at like, are these like Fourier, you use like weighted Fourier series or something like
well,
that?
Fourier and all, that was the very beginning of these descriptors, okay? That happened about 10, 15 years ago. It's evolved a lot since then. So if you want to look at what happened to descriptors and how they changed and so on, you can read our review paper. It'll give you, there's a lot of spin images. There's so many things that have happened. This is sort of the most recent area. Most of these methods are going towards machine learning based approaches. And people are looking at there are maybe three groups that I've looked at in this area. One is there's a group at Stanford in the computer science that has developed something called the heat kernel signature. They just published that last year. It's a point-based signature. And then there's another one which is based on random walks that came out of I think a group between Tsinghua and Cardiff University. So these are very current ways of coming up with more post-oblivious and more robust signatures. and also being able to capture things like like touching and so on, which are more related to human perception. Okay. Any other questions?
So the modeling for the temperature is it considering modelizing like a volume or like a little?
This is just a surface. That's a good question. So it's considering only the surface. Okay. The 3D inner distance that I showed earlier, that actually considered a volume. Good question. Okay.
So could you talk a little bit about the computational properties in terms of the time taken for the segmentation versus other approaches and so on? In this case, like for example, this flow.
Okay, it's a good question. Fang may be able to better answer. His question is related to the time taken to compute these descriptors. Is that what? And the complexity. Yeah, that's I'll give you some general answers. I mean, in general, scaling up and doing it on larger. That's an area of current direction that we are looking at, and that's an important thing. First, we wanted to understand the basics and establish a foundation so that we can move that. Certainly not n log n, but maybe Fang, you have some ideas on how long it takes and some ideas on complexity.
Not necessarily. So, well, actually, the only thing we're concerned now is like the matrix is not that big. We are actually using the alpha to calculate the Laplacian of this matrix, and then for that part, it's computation. It's really fast because we're using that part, but for complexity.
I can't hear you.
What?
I can't hear you.
Well, we can discuss after
Okay.
For the details, but the time is very important issue for in terms of it's if you can see all points, like you can very to tell the average temperature is different from point to point. This is because we're not using very high time. So if you imagine if you apply one point heat, like unit heat on one point, if you're dissipating that heat to an infinity times, all of point is going to be equal. Even it's going to be like flat down this point. So that is not
Okay.
like, it's not going to tell any information for this 3D shape.
Okay.
So yeah, for the selection of time, I think it's ongoing, like very ongoing research.
Okay.
So far.
Yeah, maybe I can also give you another different angle for this. The comparison is very fast. Okay, the histogram comparison is very fast, and it can be scaled to very large databases. In fact, our earlier work was commercialized in the engineering design area, and it's applied to very large databases. The indexing part of it is done offline, so to some extent, it really doesn't harm your real-time performance of it. But from a research point of view, and also in terms of understanding and forming the descriptors and doing other operations. For single objects, I think it can be made reasonably fast, but we certainly have to explore the complexity. And
I asked you if you want to convert this to, say, an online formulation, that becomes very important if you keep on wanting to do this for multiple images that keep coming in over a period of time.
that's correct. In the search case, the two problems get decoupled. So, but in general, computing the heat kernel on large spaces and updating it is an important issue. That's a good question. Any others? Okay. All right. So I'll be around. So if you're interested in talking to me or Yifang or anyone else from our group, feel free to catch us. Thank you very much.